OK. Bonjour tout le monde. Bienvenue à l'Espace 4, une installation de l'Université Concordia. Et merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui pour l'événement Digital Sobriety in Information Management. L'événement est diffusé en direct de l'Espace 4 et situé en territoire autochtone non cédé à Tiohtià:ke, Montréal. Ici, à l'Espace 4, nous travaillons avec la communauté universitaire pour favoriser la mobilisation du savoir. Tous les jours, nous créons ensemble des activités pour faire découvrir la recherche et les projets en cours ici à l'université, de même que la question nous intéresse. La rencontre d'aujourd'hui est une conversation en direct. Vous pouvez donc soumettre vos questions, vos commentaires par clavardage. Pour les personnes qui sont dans la salle, si vous souhaitez participer, il suffit de lever les mains et nous vous fournirons un micro. Sur ce, j'ai maintenant le plaisir de passer la parole à le Lead in Records Management and Archives, ici à l'Université Concordia, Julie Daou. Julie, bienvenue.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So, hello everyone. Thank you for attending this conference on digital sobriety in information management. It's very nice to have you all today. I'm Julie Daou, Interim Director of Concordia University Records Management and Archive team. So I'm part of the organization committee of this event too, along with my colleague Esther, Jasmin, Emmanuel, and Candice, who are also present today. I invite you to consult the code of conduct that you can find on the event page to ensure an inclusive event free of any form of discrimination or harassment. Une attitude respectueuse est attendue de tous les participants. J'invite également les personnes qui sont ici en présentiel à signer la feuille de présence. Ceci nous permettra d'obtenir des statistiques sur la participation à cet événement. Veuillez noter aussi que cette conférence est certifiée événement durable or. So this event was born from the reflection sparked by our participation in the World Digital Cleanup Day. We realize that the move to a digital environment, we have begun to accumulate a very large volume of documents and information. This introduces a lot of issues from ecological, economical, technological, and archival point of view. We then ask ourselves, how can archivists and information managers can participate in establishing a culture of digital sobriety in order to reduce our digital footprint? So we thought about this event. So today we have the honor of welcoming 4 experts who will talk about the important issue of digital sobriety. So we have Carole Marti and Mailloux from Hydro-Québec, Tessa Walsh from Webrecorder, and Pedro Peres-Neto, who is professor here at Concordia University. So they will describe the environmental impact of digital technology and ways to reduce our digital management footprint through digital sobriety strategies. So now I invite my colleague Emmanuel Walsh to come and present our first speakers. Thank you.
Bonjour, nous allons commencer avec la présentation d'Hydro-Québec. Nous avons Carole Marti, qui est conseillère en gestion des connaissances chez Hydro-Québec depuis 2007. Elle travaille sur des projets de gestion et de transfert des connaissances pour le personnel de l'entreprise. Elle accompagne des équipes pour la mise en place de stratégies favorisant la collaboration, la continuité et le développement des connaissances, ainsi que le développement de communautés de pratique. Titulaire d'un doctorat en sciences de gestion de l'Université Montpellier II, ses travaux de recherche portaient sur la gestion des connaissances et plus précisément sur les narrations comme outil de partage des expériences. Elle a publié ses travaux dans de nombreux congrès internationaux et dans 2 ouvrages collectifs. Elle participe régulièrement à des conférences en tant qu'experte de son domaine. Elle enseigne le cours de gestion des connaissances au programme en gestion de l'ingénierie depuis 2007 et elle agit aussi comme superviseur universitaire. Avec elle aujourd'hui, nous avons Mailloux, qui s'est joint à Hydro-Québec en 2020 comme architecte des technologies de l'information. Il a la responsabilité de la conception des solutions de stockage et de protection des données. Sa vision stratégique contribue à établir la feuille de route technologique sur 5 ans des solutions stockage et protection des données afin d'appuyer le virage numérique de l'entreprise. Avec plus de 20 ans dans le marché des technologies de l'information, il a occupé les rôles d'administrateur, d'intégrateur et architecte de stockage et de la protection des données de plusieurs pétabytes pour des entreprises telles que Desjardins, le Cirque du Soleil et Transat. Il est titulaire d'un DEC en informatique et d'un microprogramme en gestion de projet de HEC. À vous la parole.
Merci beaucoup.
Oh, ça s'en vient.
OK. Donc, merci pour... OK. Est-ce que maintenant, c'est mieux?
Bon, ça devrait être correct.
Oui.
Ouais.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, merci pour votre invitation. La présentation qu'on va vous faire aujourd'hui avec Christian, c'est la sobriété numérique comme axe d'intervention pour une saine gestion de l'information, le cas Hydro-Québec. Donc, avec Christian, on a l'habitude de travailler ensemble, de parler ensemble, donc on va un peu s'échanger, se poser des questions. Donc, on compte sur vous pour nous dire si on rentre dans le temps qui est prévu, qu'on ne prenne pas trop de temps pour les autres collègues qui vont présenter. Donc, très rapidement, Hydro-Québec, tout le monde connaît, c'est une entreprise qui produit, qui transporte et qui distribue l'électricité. C'est une des plus grandes entreprises d'hydroélectricité au Canada et dans le monde. Rapidement aussi, nous vous présentons les 5 priorités du plan d'action 2035. C'est sûr que Christian, aux technologies numériques, moi, en gestion de l'information, on n'est pas directement dans le cœur de métier, mais on est là pour soutenir. Donc, les 5 priorités du plan d'action 2035 sont améliorer la qualité du service, 2, aider notre clientèle à faire une meilleure consommation de l'énergie, 3, augmenter la production d'électricité, 4, collaborer plus étroitement avec les communautés autochtones et finalement devenir une organisation agile, innovante et transparente. Donc c'est sûr que nos spécialités se placent beaucoup pour le soutien des employés d'Hydro-Québec pour devenir une organisation agile, innovante et transparente. Donc, Christian, n'importe quand, tu me coupes.
En ce moment, tout va bien de ton côté.
C'est beau, c'est beau. Donc, moi, je suis dans l'équipe de gestion de l'information et notre travail se positionne dans une information accessible et de qualité est essentielle pour faire évoluer l'organisation. Donc, c'est là-dedans qu'on se place. Vous voyez tout en haut notre petit logo, je vais y revenir. Une hydro égale une info, mieux travailler ensemble. Donc, c'est ça un petit peu notre credo dans lequel on se place. Quand on parle de gestion de l'information, la sobriété numérique est un des axes d'intervention dans lequel on se positionne, dans lequel on communique. Donc, une bonne gestion de l'information, ça implique d'avoir des comportements info-responsables. Donc, j'en ai mis quelques exemples ici, enregistrer l'information dans les bons systèmes. De ne pas avoir une multiplication de l'information dans différents systèmes ou une redondance. On sensibilise aussi les employés à la gestion des accès, avoir les bonnes informations accessibles aux bonnes personnes. On dit beaucoup de partager des hyperliens. Justement, quand on parle d'avoir l'information à une seule place, en partageant un hyperlien, il pointe à un seul endroit qui est toujours le même, un document qui est toujours à jour, et ça évite de s'échanger des courriels qui sont lourds et qui ont une grande empreinte numérique. Et,
si tu me permets une petite affaire, c'est justement, tu sais, quand on parle de bonne gestion de l'information, puis moi, où j'arrive dans tout ça, c'est la collaboration qu'on a, moi et Carole, c'est que moi, j'y amène tous les impacts au niveau du stockage, au niveau des TI, pour leur dire, mais regarde, écoute, quand vous faites ça, voici l'impact qui arrive en arrière. C'est comme, soit qu'on diminue, soit on augmente le stockage. Fait que c'est vraiment comme ça que Carole et moi, on s'est connus à l'intérieur d'Hydro-Québec.
Oui, finalement, moi et toutes les personnes de mon équipe, on travaille directement à aider les employés. Puis Christian, il est finalement un peu en arrière, dans les coulisses, dans ses serveurs et toutes ses machines. Mais on a besoin de travailler ensemble parce qu'on utilise les mêmes outils. Et on suggère aussi, ou on essaye de sensibiliser les personnes à faire du ménage dans les courriels, les documents, pour détruire ce qui est désuet, ce qui est plus nécessaire. Donc, avoir une bonne gestion de l'information, ça entraîne de contribuer à la performance de l'entreprise et de son personnel. Par exemple, un des principaux bénéfices, c'est diminuer le temps de recherche. Annuellement, on a un sondage auprès de 4000 employés dans l'entreprise où on essaye de voir combien de temps passent les gens à chercher l'information. On voit qu'en moyenne, on est à un peu plus de 2 heures. Donc, ce temps, comment on peut le compresser au maximum? En ayant des bons comportements info-responsables, en gérant bien l'information. C'est sûr qu'il y aura toujours un temps de recherche de l'information, mais l'idée, c'est de le diminuer au maximum. Centralisation de l'information, on veut que l'information soit facilement accessible à ceux qui en ont besoin. J'ai mis l'exemple de numérisation parce que, par exemple, il y a quelques années, on pouvait trouver des documents qui étaient accessibles dans des centrales. Les gens qui devaient en avoir besoin étaient obligés de se déplacer pour consulter cette documentation. Donc là, on a un virage numérique et la plupart des documents qui sont consultables numériquement, donc de partout et accessibles aux bonnes personnes. Et bien sûr, on veut conserver seulement les documents qui sont nécessaires à la prise de décision et pas garder au cas où.
C'est un comportement très typique des personnes. Tu sais, c'est « Ah, je vais le prendre puis je vais le conserver au cas où j'en aurais besoin. » Mais on va tous les mettre dans du stockage. Puis à un moment donné, bien, ce stockage-là en arrière, il continue à grossir pour des données du « au cas où, d'un coup que j'en ai besoin », « in case of », tu sais, j'en ai « I need it ». Tu sais.
Absolument. Puis, notre objectif aussi, c'est d'améliorer la qualité de l'actif informationnel. Ça passe par quelque chose qui intéresse beaucoup Christian, c'est l'application du calendrier de conservation, c'est détruire les documents qui sont obsolètes, c'est diminuer les risques informationnels parce que si on ne détruit pas, ça nous augmente les risques informationnels et bien entendu diminuer le temps de recherche. On y revient encore une fois ici parce que si j'ai une masse d'informations, ben ça me prend encore plus de temps d'aller chercher la bonne information que j'ai besoin pour faire mon travail. Puis toutes ces actions favorisent la sobriété numérique. Donc, en fait, une bonne gestion de l'information entraîne une diminution de l'empreinte du numérique. Donc, pour nous, c'est un axe de communication et de collaboration pour les employés. Donc, en fait, nous, on s'est posé la question comment intéresser les employés à la gestion de l'information? Parce que ce n'est pas toujours très...
Sexy.
Merci. La gestion de l'information. Donc, comment le rendre un peu plus attrayant pour les personnes. Donc, on a fait des groupes de discussion pour connaître un peu l'intérêt des membres du personnel d'Hydro-Québec. Puis, à notre surprise, on pensait qu'une certaine partie des employés seraient intéressés par le volet empreinte numérique, mais en fait, dans nos groupes de discussion, ça a été vraiment 100% des employés. Puis les gens, ce qu'ils nous disaient, c'est que avec le papier, c'est facile de voir qu'on accumule, puis qu'on en a plein, parce qu'à un moment donné, on n'a plus de place, on est obligé de faire du ménage. Avec le numérique, ben, pour l'employé lambda, comme je suis, ben pour moi, c'est gratuit, je ne vois pas, je le classe, et ça n'a pas d'impact. Mais quand on explique, et puis quand on comprend, moi aussi, je me suis éduquée là-dedans, qu'il y a un impact du numérique, il y a des coûts économiques, des coûts sur l'empreinte numérique, etc. Donc, c'est un axe de communication qui est intéressant.
Et c'est là où moi, j'embarque en jeu. Quand Carole a dit, justement, je n'étais pas éduqué. Nous, de notre côté, vous avez l'impression que c'est toujours infini, mais en arrière, nous autres, on patine pour justement toujours garder l'espace. Ça nous arrive à tout le monde. Tu es sur ton téléphone, tu as un paquet de photos, puis à un moment donné, tu arrives, tu dis « Ah, je suis plus capable d'enregistrer. Ah, ben, il m'a déplacé ça dans le cloud. » Ou tu vas commencer à faire du ménage un peu. Mais c'est toujours, nous, en arrière, on est toujours en train de mettre du stockage pour s'assurer que vous n'ayez pas ce « Ah, j'ai plus de place. » C'est souvent ça qu'on a dans les entreprises.
Puis, pour continuer dans ce travail, ben nous, la gestion de l'information, on collabore énormément, bien entendu, avec le groupe des technologies numériques. Puis, il y a plusieurs projets en cours pour détruire l'information des US, pour automatiser certains processus de gestion de l'information, ben, comme la destruction automatique ou le classement automatique de certaines informations pour aider les employés, parce que tous les comportements que je vous ai présentés dans la diapo précédente, c'est sûr qu'on veut que les gens soient sensibilisés à le faire eux-mêmes, mais aussi que les systèmes nous aident à avoir ces bons comportements en gestion de l'information. Puis finalement, on va collaborer avec beaucoup d'autres groupes, parce que pour nous, en gestion de l'information, c'est important de communiquer. On travaille aussi avec les gens de développement durable, avec les gens de développement des compétences, avec les gens d'amélioration continue. Donc, on essaye d'établir des liens et surtout de ne pas rester dans notre coin. L'autre axe, c'est l'axe communication. Dans notre équipe, on a de la chance d'avoir des collègues qui ont vraiment des compétences en communication, en marketing, même si ce n'est pas leur spécialité, mais ils ont fait les bons liens. Donc, on a essayé de rendre notre offre de services et nos communications plus marketing, plus attrayante pour les employés. On a un slogan qui s'appelle « Une hydro, une info ». On a une signature graphique, un logo, comme je vous ai montré au début. On a des communautés de pratique. Notre communauté de pratique qui est sur Yammer s'appelle Une hydro, une info. On a un site intranet qu'on vise à être N0 où les gens trouvent beaucoup d'informations, trouvent beaucoup d'outils en libre service, et on essaye d'avoir le plus d'occasions de communiquer avec les employés en utilisant les infolettres des différents groupes de l'entreprise. Ensuite, au niveau des événements, on a un événement, je pense qu'il avait plu à certains de nos collègues l'année dernière, là, quand on en avait parlé au congrès de la AQ, c'était les Olympiades de l'information. Donc, on le refait cette année pour une deuxième année, et on a invité notre collègue Christian. En fait, donc, c'est la thématique, comme vous comprenez, des Jeux olympiques, et on offre comme des activités aux gens pour participer à des activités. Donc, l'activité à laquelle Christian participe, c'est le ménage et l'empreinte du numérique. Donc, on va suggérer aux gens de faire un peu du ménage. On a une activité qui s'appelle le tir au OneNote, parce que je ne sais pas si vous utilisez OneNote, mais OneNote, c'est facile d'avoir beaucoup de pages. Puis à un moment donné, on en a tellement qu'on ne s'y retrouve plus. Donc, le tirer OneNote, c'est supprimer quelques pages. J'ai des collègues qui ont beaucoup d'imagination, donc qui ont trouvé des activités qui sont très utiles, mais en même temps qui se veulent aussi assez ludiques pour éduquer, sensibiliser et pour passer à l'action. On organise aussi des conférences internes. On les appelle les rendez-vous in hydro, in info. Là, on a toujours notre slogan qu'on utilise. Et on fait aussi parce que Hydro-Québec, c'est plus de 20 000 employés et il y a peut-être plus de la moitié qui sont des employés de terrain. Donc, c'est aussi difficile de les toucher dans ce genre d'événements. Donc, on a une hydromobile. Une hydromobile, c'est un camion électrique qui se déplace aux couleurs d'Hydro-Québec et on l'utilise souvent à la période estivale pour aller dans les différents bureaux d'Hydro-Québec ailleurs dans la province où on va à la rencontre beaucoup du personnel terrain et on leur parle un petit peu de la gestion de l'information, mais d'un point de vue qui les intéresse, parce que le personnel terrain consulte beaucoup d'informations pour faire ses travaux. Donc, c'est sûr que parfois, ils en créent un peu moins, mais ils en utilisent beaucoup. C'est des gens aussi qui cherchent beaucoup l'information dont ils ont besoin pour faire leur travail. Donc, c'est très pertinent de leur parler de gestion de l'information. Puis, toutes ces communications, tous ces événements ont pour objectif de rappeler les bons comportements en gestion de l'information. Puis là, ma dernière diapo après je te passe la parole, Christian. Donc, la gestion de l'information, ça concerne l'ensemble du personnel. Donc, pour nous, à Hydro, l'information, c'est un actif qui est stratégique à gérer, exploiter et à valoriser et qui doit être de qualité. Donc, on veut sensibiliser et responsabiliser l'ensemble du personnel de l'entreprise. On veut saisir toutes les opportunités de communication et adapter nos messages aux différents publics. Et la sobriété numérique, c'est un axe d'intervention et de communication qui est important et qui fait partie de nos actions. Donc, c'est à toi, Christian.
Bien, merci. Tout ça, toute cette stratégie-là a un impact, okay? Surtout au niveau TI, au niveau des infrastructures et au niveau du stockage. T'sais, quand on parle à un moment donné de temps de réponse ou de temps de recherche, nous, de notre côté, on est obligé de rajouter de l'infrastructure pour toujours garder ce temps de recherche-là à un niveau acceptable. Donc, il y a toujours, tous ces comportements-là amènent un impact sur les TI, puis c'est un impact techniquement positif. Donc, je vais vous donner un peu d'historique. Depuis les 10-15 dernières années, on a une explosion des données. Okay? Que ce soit du multimédia, de la vidéo, des bases de données ou même les réseaux sociaux. Tout le monde en génère de la donnée. On parle aussi des données analytiques, on parle du big data, des data lakes, même de l'intelligence artificielle. On a la multiplication des environnements TI. On crée une application, avant qu'elle soit en production, tu as du développement, tu as un environnement de test et contrôle, un environnement de pré-production, puis c'est toujours une copie des copies des données de la production. Fait que ça en génère beaucoup de données. Pour vous donner un exemple, en 2006, quand je travaillais pour une compagnie entertainment, le Cirque du Soleil, on était dans les derniers backups qu'on faisait une fois par nuit, on était proche du terabyte de données qui étaient changées. En 2022, je suis rendu chez Hydro-Québec, oui, c'est plus gros, mais on parle quand même d'1 pétabyte de données qui changent par nuit au complet. Fait que c'est 1000 fois plus. Fait qu'on voit vraiment, oui, il y a plus de systèmes, oui, c'est plus gros, mais on voit quand même cette exponentialité-là de l'explosion des données. Excuse-moi, j'ai comme perdu un peu mon truc. Il y a aussi, il ne faut pas oublier une chose, quand on parle de multiplication des environnements TI, on parle aussi de sauvegarde. Chaque donnée qui est gérée, nous autres en arrière, on la protège, puis on ne la protège pas plus qu'une fois, 2 fois, parce que on est paranoïaque sur la perte de données, ce qui veut dire c'est que je vais en avoir une copie, mais je vais en envoyer une autre ailleurs. Puis, il y a aussi ce qu'on appelle en informatique le disaster recovery ou la continuité de service. T'sais, ton service est hyper critique, tu vas t'arranger pour avoir l'autre côté, dans un autre site, le même service, pour être sûr et certain que si tu tombes d'un côté, tu vas l'avoir de l'autre part. C'est normal, ça fait partie des TI, mais c'est aussi le principe même que toutes les données se doublent. Puis, tout le monde a la mauvaise conception que le stockage n'est pas cher. Oui, c'est comme ça que je vais le dire. C'est que, oui, quand tu l'achètes, il est vraiment pas cher, mais tes coûts d'exploitation, ils explosent. Puis, juste dans le graphique que tu as là ici, c'est que ta croissance des données est exponentielle. Okay? Ton coût par stockage, que ce soit on-prem ou que ce soit dans les clouds, AWS, Azure, dans les clouds publics, ton coût, tu vas voir, il est toujours très bas. Mais après ça, tu as ceux qui s'en occupent, là, les admins, les techniciens, les gestionnaires de projet, et tous les monkeys qui sont là pour garder le service, bien, on ne coûte pas 2 piastres non plus. Là. Fait que tes budgets TI augmentent. Mais tu génères tellement de données, puis qu'on est toujours en train d'investir en stockage, puis est-ce que ta donnée est vraiment bonne? Est-ce qu'elle est monnayable? Est-ce qu'elle est pertinente? Donc, ce qui arrive, c'est que tu en génères tellement que tu te retrouves avec un manque à gagner au niveau de tes TI, parce que la seule affaire que tu fais, c'est que tu mets de l'argent en arrière pour juste garder le stockage. Si tu n'as pas de sobriété numérique ou si tu n'as pas de principe de ALM, là, de cycle de vie de la donnée, bien, nous autres, en arrière, la seule affaire qu'on va faire, c'est qu'on va ajouter du stockage, puis les coûts vont augmenter. Ah, là, je l'ai. Moi aussi. En informatique, il y a de la misère à fonctionner un clicker. Not bad. Fait que, tu sais, juste pour vous donner un exemple, chez Hydro-Québec, on parle de plus de 20 pétabytes de données dans nos centrales. Okay? On a environ 300 pétabytes de backup. Ça, c'est confondu au complet. Dans notre info nuagique, avec toute la transformation numérique qu'on fait, on dépense les 2 pétabytes. Okay? On a un taux de croissance annuel d'environ 12 % pour les bases de données. Puis, quand c'est des données non structurées, on parle de services de fichiers, de stockage d'objets, c'est un peu le pêle-mêle, des documents, des archives, tout ça. Mais c'est une croissance de 15 à 20 %. C'est énorme comme génération de données. On calcule que si tu as un pétabyte de données, 5 ans plus tard, tu en as 2. Ça veut dire qu'il faut que tu le copies, que tu le répliques l'autre bord. Puis, pas toutes les données devraient être répliquées, doivent être sauvegardées. C'est ça qu'on doit amener, puis ce qu'on essaye avec les gens de la gestion documentaire, c'est d'amener ce réflexe-là pour dire, si je génère une donnée, est-ce qu'elle est importante? Est-ce que je dois la conserver pendant 20 ans? Oui, il y a des lois, oui, il y a des normes à suivre, mais c'est quand tu as une politique qui te dit, ben regarde, je dois conserver ces données-là pendant 7 ans, mais quand tu es rendu à 7 ans plus un jour, là, efface-le. Je suis sûr et certain que tout le monde ici, on a des drives personnels, on a des OneDrive, ou même, je crois que l'Université Concordia doit offrir des drives personnels où tu mets toutes tes affaires. Si tous les étudiants ou tous les comptes de l'Université Concordia disent, regarde, écoute, je fais le ménage en même temps, puis je coupe 10 %, bien là, c'est 10 % de tout le monde. Le gars des TI en arrière, là, il est content, il est heureux parce qu'il n'aura pas besoin d'aller voir son boss pour dire « Hey, j'ai besoin de 5 millions juste pour donner du stockage à tout le monde. » Fait que c'est sûr et certain, c'est énorme l'impact. Tout le monde a l'impression que c'est gratuit, mais en arrière, nous autres, on court comme des poules pas de tête. C'est pour justement toujours maintenir le service à jour. Fait que c'est important de faire comprendre au monde l'impact, que ce soit 10 emails, 10 megs, 20 megs que vous changez, vous enlevez, bien, c'est tout cumulé ensemble, bien, c'est peut-être 1 an ou 2 où qu'on n'est pas obligé d'investir en termes d'informatique. Puis c'est vraiment ça qu'on essaie, tranquillement pas vite, à amener à éduquer le monde. Et moi, j'arrive là, puis je leur dis les chiffres. Oui, tu veux garder tout, tu veux garder ça pendant 20 ans, bien, voici combien ça va te coûter. Là, c'est drôle à dire, le monde font comme « Oh, OK, attends une minute, mais finalement, j'ai peut-être pas besoin de ça, j'ai peut-être pas besoin de ça. » Il y en a d'autres qui vont dire « Ben, regarde, écoute, l'entreprise a de l'argent, mais continue, paye, puis moi, je m'en fous. » C'est ça, ces comportements-là qu'on essaie de changer. Pour vous donner une idée, 300 pétabytes de données, OK, c'est l'équivalent, pour un vieux comme moi, de 65 millions de DVD, okay? Ou de 4,4 millions de Blu-ray. Mais là, je vais donner ça un petit peu plus à la Netflix. Tout le monde a Netflix, tout le monde fait du streaming online. Un streaming Netflix, 1 heure en HD, selon leur site, c'est d'environ 7 gigs. 300 pétabytes, si je décide de le streamer en continu, c'est 4800 années de streaming. J'arrête. Fait que finalement, peut-être qu'on va avoir la fin de One Punch, pour ceux qui suivent les mangas. Là. Fait que c'est pour ça que nous, quand on parle de politique de gestion du cycle de vie de l'information et de la donnée, ça nous permet, nous, de notre côté TI, de continuer à garder la croissance et de la réduire, puis aussi de mieux contrôler les budgets ou les coûts de l'information. Ça a vraiment un impact. Nous, ce qu'on fait aussi, c'est qu'on gère les contenants et pas le contenu. Vous êtes responsable du contenu, vous connaissez mieux le contenu que nous autres. Nous autres, en arrière, on va justement se retrouver pour dire « OK, ça, c'est ce que tu contiens, je dois toujours garder mon service. » Et c'est ça l'importance de bien communiquer ensemble et de travailler ensemble. Je pense que je suis en train de te voler la slide.
Non, mais c'est la conclusion, mais c'est parfait.
Là, ici, je m'en excuse.
Non, non, mais c'est parfait.
Mais c'est ça, c'est pour ça que c'est important de parler avec les gens de TN. On est weird, oui, OK. C'est comme, on n'est pas sauvage. Fait que venez nous voir. T'sais. Puis aussi, s'il y a quelqu'un des TI qui vous dit ben, je vais effacer vos données, vous dites non, regarde, c'est moi qui ai le contrôle sur les données. C'est mes données à moi, c'est moi qui connais le plus l'importance de la valeur. Nous, dans notre côté, on offre le service de stockage. Mais on va vous dire, fais ton ménage, parce que si tu veux garder tes coûts bas, ou si tu ne veux pas qu'on soit toujours en train de mettre de l'argent, puis surtout des données qui sont là, puis que le monde, après ça, ne savent plus à qui ça appartient, bien nous, en arrière, on est toujours obligé d'émigrer sur les nouveaux stockages, sur du nouveau stockage. Fait que c'est ça, on parle de l'importance de communiquer avec les gens de TI, puis il va leur dire, regarde, écoute, ça serait le fun qu'ils nous disent combien de stockage que je prends, combien ça coûte. Ça donne une meilleure perspective. Je te laisse le dernier point.
Bien, c'est ça. Donc, les avantages de travailler ensemble, je pense que c'est très clair. Puis, c'est la même chose avec l'arrivée de l'intelligence artificielle, parce qu'on veut travailler sur des données fiables, donc des données de qualité. Donc, c'est la même chose, ménage, etc.
Je ne suis pas un spécialiste de l'intelligence artificielle, mais de mon point de vue, de la façon que je le vois, c'est que c'est autant intéressant, mais aussi épeurant. Ce que je veux dire par là, c'est que c'est super intéressant parce que pour que ton algorithme d'intelligence artificielle fonctionne bien, il faut que ta donnée, ton information soit clean. Elle n'a pas besoin de toutes ces données périmées ou des données qui ne sont pas bonnes. Fait que ça va te forcer à faire un ménage là-dessus. L'autre chose, c'est que ça va aussi générer tellement de données que ça peut aussi, c'est pour ça que mon côté architecte de stockage me dit, oui, c'est le fun, mais j'imagine toute la donnée qui peut être générée par l'intelligence artificielle ou le big data, oui, c'est important, mais il faut justement dire à un moment donné, ce serait peut-être temps que je l'efface, ça va être correct. Puis, nous autres aussi, de notre côté, on commence à l'utiliser, l'intelligence artificielle, sur c'est quoi la donnée que j'ai à l'intérieur, faire l'indexage, tout ça, puis comprendre ta donnée. Parce que moi, je ne peux pas arriver et dire, OK, regarde, écoute, ta donnée que tu as là, ça fait 10 ans que tu le traînes chez nous. Et là, il va dire, OK, c'est quoi que j'ai dedans? Bien là, je suis au moins avec tous ces logiciels-là d'intelligence artificielle qui vont me permettre de comprendre la donnée qui est à l'intérieur sur nos tours. Mais je pourrais dire, regarde, écoute, ça, ces données-là font partie de tel contexte, mais ça prend aussi la gestion de l'information pour leur dire, regarde, ça va dans tel endroit, puis tu peux le garder.
Il faut t'arrêter.
Oui.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci.
Greetings, everyone. Our next speaker will be Tessa Walsh. Tessa Walsh is a software developer and digital preservationist based in Montreal. She is the senior application and tools engineer at Webrecorder, where she works on free and open source high-fidelity web archiving tools. Prior to joining Webrecorder, she was a software developer on the open source Archivematica and Access to Memory, ATOM, projects at Architectural Systems. Before pursuing software development professionally, Tessa established digital preservation programs as digital preservation librarian at Concordia, University Library here, and as a digital archivist at the Canadian Centre for Architecture, just a few streets away. Her research interests include web archiving, preservation of digital design records such as CAD, BIM or BIM? All right, perfect. And 3D modeling, environmental sustainability, and management of personal and sensitive information in digital archives. So,
thank you. How's that? Is that picking me up? Oh, yeah, there we go. Good morning, everybody. Very nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm going to be talking about digital preservation, its environmental impact, and how we can help manage that a bit. In retrospect, probably reckoning is a little scary for a title, but yeah, you know. I was going to introduce myself. That's already been done beautifully. So I don't think this is, I don't think there's much here new. What I will say is maybe just to explain a little bit further about my current work at Webrecorder. So we work on high fidelity web archiving tools. Essentially what that means is that we make free and open source software so that people can record as an archive anything that you can see in your browser and be able to play it back at full fidelity at any time later offline without requiring an internet connection. And we work with all sorts of folks from digital artists to journalists to libraries and archives, increasingly like dance studios, individuals, companies who want to keep an archive of their own web presence. Yeah, we think it's an important part of modern archiving to be able to easily capture the modern web experience, which is a difficult technical problem, as you might imagine, given the prevalence of like very JavaScript heavy web applications all over the web now, which don't necessarily work all that well with kind of the last generation of web crawling tools. So I'm going to briefly talk about kind of at a high level what digital preservation is to give some context for the rest of the presentation. And I think when we think about digital preservation, we can think about it as like a practice and a profession. The practice is something that is done by organizations, by individuals, really kind of done ad hoc by everyone to some degree or other, which is trying to take active measures to make sure that things of value that are only in digital form, maybe were born digital, maybe were on an older analog source but have been converted because that analog source was degrading, something like a floppy disk or a VHS tape. Yeah, so the practice is making sure that these things that have value for whatever reason, right? It can be cultural value, it can be legal value, it can be financial value to a company for a certain period. We want to make sure that these things continue to be usable well into the future, which comes with a number of challenges, which I'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. It's also a profession that was interestingly sort of born out of the need to manage space data in the 1980s and 90s. So a lot of the standardization in the field was actually started by NASA and other space agencies because it's extraordinarily expensive to run experiments in space, as you imagine. If you lose that data or that data corrupts, it's not exactly easy to go replicate the experiment and get a new set of data. So they were kind of early in on the field on recognizing the importance of digital preservation and kind of starting to standardize it through an ISO standardization process in terms of what a digital archive looks like. Very quickly, that got picked up by places like libraries and archives, starting at kind of like a national level and some very well-resourced universities. And since then, it's really spread, where, oh, there we go, where you'll find digital preservation practitioners in all kinds of organizations, from those kind of traditional places like a university to even like sports teams, like kind of just all over the place. There are some ISO standards. You'll like never see a digital preservation presentation probably without seeing that little diagram in the lower left there, which is called the Open Archival Information System Reference Model. It comes from that work from the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems that went into this standardization early on. And we have standards for things like audit and certification of what makes a digital repository trustworthy. Basically, how well does it follow the standard? How well are they covering their bases on a technological level, on an organizational level, sustainability from like a financial sustainability perspective, things like that. Now, the number of organizations that have actually been certified as a trustworthy digital repository is extremely low. It's a kind of onerous process. But it still helps us inform our practice by understanding like what the best practices that we should be aiming for are. So to make things a little more concrete than like high-level reference diagrams and all of that, why do we need to do digital preservation? What are the risks to digital objects? I really like, it's an older model slightly at this point, but I really like the SPOT model for risk assessment that was published in 2012. As a kind of high-level model for understanding the kinds of risks that we're talking about. So the first risk is just availability. Did we keep the file to begin with? I can tell you my personal digital preservation journey began when a band I was in longer ago than I would care to admit we recorded an album that never got released, but I had the masters from the recording studio, and I was the only person who had them. And they were on my laptop, and that laptop, its hard drive got fried, and those are lost to time forever, unless someone else on the internet who's seeing this has a copy, in which case let me know. But so things can happen like that. The file gets deleted by accident or during a big information cleanup project, and that information wasn't duplicated anywhere else, or most of the time it's just due to sort of benign neglect. People keep a hard drive of like their old backups in a closet somewhere, and then, you know, it doesn't make a move, or there's a fire, or they say, I don't need this, and throw it out in like a Marie Kondo cleaning fit, or what have you. But even if we kept the files, we also need to be able to identify what they are. So if you have thousands or millions of files that all have kind of like generic names, and you don't have any metadata, any other system to be able to kind of like remind yourself what these files are and where you can find them, it's very possible that you might have the information, but in a file that's called like image_86207, and you'll never find it again. Persistence, has there been data loss? Modern computing systems, modern hardware is pretty good at having redundancies, at catching file corruptions, but not quite as good as people kind of think in a lay sense. Files corrupt, either because the media that they're on has a physicality to it and has some damage over time, or I mean, there's a fascinating, there's podcasts on this, I won't go too far down the rabbit hole, but also like photons from the sun randomly flip bits in our systems all the time. That's why cars and airlines have tons of redundant systems. Because a 1 becomes a 0 and that becomes a problem unless you have other redundant systems, but that can happen in our storage units. That's caused car accidents, voting scandals, all sorts of things. It's really fascinating. Renderability. Okay, we kept the file, we know where it is, it hasn't corrupted or changed, the bit stream is the same as it used to be. Can we open and interact with it? This is a challenge I ran into a lot when I was a digital archivist at the Canadian Centre for Architecture just down the road, where we were collecting the records of kind of early innovative digital architectural projects from, say, the 1980s to the early aughts. A lot of those files were in file formats that were tied either to specific hardware from the time or in software where like backwards compatibility is not really so much of a thing and there wasn't a clear migration path. So if you have Form Z CAD files from like 1994, say, there's not a straightforward way to be able to open those files and interact with them these days. You can go down an emulation road, but then there's all kinds of difficulties with that. So just to say, if the file formats become obsolete or the software is no longer available or whatever, then that information's still no good to us even though we kept it, right? Understandability. Do we have enough context to use it meaningfully? Say you get that Form Z CAD file open. Do you know how to use the software? Do you know what you're doing? I think there are I've heard interesting anecdotes about this from places that have gone way down the emulation road, like Yale University Library, where you can go from their library catalog, click on a thing, and it opens up the original software in an emulator of the original operating system. All of that using the easy emulation software, which is really cool. But then you get a 20-year-old student looking at software from like 15 years ago. Do they know how to deal with it? There's a really interesting YouTube video that I watched years ago, but has stuck in my mind about this too, where like current graphic designers at the height of their practice are asked to go back and use Photoshop version 1.0. And the number of things that they forgot that are like features that came later or features that got abandoned, whatever, really makes them stop, and they kind of struggle to interact with their own files from that long ago in the original software. And that's only kind of like technical context. Like maybe things are in a language that's like the user doesn't know how to read that. Like there are human kind of aspects of understandability here too. And finally, authenticity. Are we sure it is what it says it is? And this is something that comes up a lot in like legal proceedings. There is some court precedent, at least in the United States that I know, on using web archives as legal evidence, but it's tricky. And any question of authenticity, especially if we're talking about something that's experiential, like using software can be, is really tricky. But at the very minimum, can we guarantee that the bit stream, the ones and zeros of that file, are the same as they used to be, is kind of a low-level way of approaching that. So some of the practices that are common in digital preservation to account for this are appraising material for long-term value. So we don't want to store everything, right? We don't want to keep everything forever. We never did that with physical archives. We shouldn't do it with digital ones just because it kind of seems like we can. And I think all of the talks today will go into why that is. We tend to keep multiple independent geographically separated copies of data. So if something is high value, we probably have one copy, say, on like a local server. We might have one copy in the cloud somewhere. We might have one backup copy on LTO tape, like off the island. And the reasons for that are that we don't want any single point of failure to be able to take out the whole archive and all of our copies. Whether that's an earthquake on the island of Montreal, or like a fire in a building. If your backups are on an external hard drive in the same place as your primary copy and there's a fire, there goes all your copies, right? So we really try to avoid those single points of failure. We tend to do periodic integrity checks. You might also hear these called as fixity checks or checking checksums to ensure that data hasn't changed or corrupted, so that we can say, yes, this file is what it purports to be. It's the same file that came into the archive, no matter how many decades on it's being accessed. We implement strategies to guard against file format obsolescence. So a lot of the software that people use for digital preservation systems or digital repository systems or digital asset management systems will sort of on ingest automatically migrate files that are in at-risk formats to open standardized formats that we expect will be useful for the longer term. There's also emulation use cases, like I said. There's a whole subset of forensic recovery practices that sometimes get used dealing with obsolete media. I can't tell you how many zip disks, jazz drives, SciQuest cartridges, old hard drives, whatever, I've had to figure out in my 10 years or so of doing this, how to get files off of reliably. And there's all kinds of digital forensics hardware and software that helps us with that. But it also sometimes involves going on Facebook Marketplace and buying an old like Mac laptop that has an SD card slot, but can also open that floppy disk that you have. That was that 5-year period where Apple made their floppy disks like variable speed, so they don't work with any other floppy disk drives. And there's organizational commitment. All these practices don't mean anything if 10 years down the road an organization decides, we don't really want to do this anymore, or there's no funding, or the staff gets cut. Which is why I really like this quote by Trevor Owens from the Theory and Craft of Digital Preservation. Nothing has been preserved, there are only things being preserved. Preservation is the result of ongoing work of people and commitments of resources. And I try to remember this in conversations with people because it can be really easy in like a professional setting to be like, do you have this preserved? People want a yes or no, but that's not really how it works. It only works as long as that chain remains unbroken, right? Some examples of what digital archives can look like. The Internet Archive is probably a place that's familiar to most or all of you. They host the Wayback Machine. They're the largest public web archive in the world. They also have really cool collections of like software and video and things. So for example, this is the Prelinger Archives, which is a audiovisual archive based out of California. That is a lot of like home movies, educational videos, the kind of like day-to-day videos that we may not think of in other archives as being worthy of preservation. They focus exclusively on that. And you can go to the Internet Archive to their website and watch these videos, download a copy, whatever. And on their back end, they're doing all kinds of preservation practices to make sure this collection remains as it is. This is a recent example. So this is a screenshot of some of the software that we make at Webrecorder. This is a tool called Browser Tricks, kind of an all-in-one browser-based tool for crawling web content, being able to do quality assurance on your crawls to make sure that the offline replay matches what we see on the live web. You can replay it live in the browser. So what you're actually seeing here is, let's see if, oh yeah, it does work. This is an iframe that is embedding a web archive of this Vice Gender Spectrum site that we crawled a lot of Vice magazine sites when they announced that they were shutting down very recently, in part because journalists were freaking out because their work was going to go missing and things like that. But what we can see here, yeah, so this is an iframe that is doing a live replay of this website as was captured entirely offline, not connected to the internet at all, using our tool Replay Web Page, which is kind of embedded in Browser Tricks. But I'll show you other examples where people can also embed that into like access systems, websites, really wherever you want. This is an older Webrecorder tool, but a very cool one, just to kind of show you how we can keep going down the rabbit hole. So this is Old Web Today, which shout out Ilya, my boss, incredible developer, does really cool stuff. So what you're seeing here is this is a capture of GeoCities from 1996 in the Wayback Machine in the Internet Archive that is running in Netscape Navigator 3 in, I would guess, like Mac OS 7 or 8, something like that. So essentially, we are running an old operating system in an emulator and then calling up the browser that people would have actually interacted with this website from, and then loading up the website from an archive, which gives you kind of the experience of what visiting that website in 1996 was more like. Certainly more so than kind of going to the Wayback Machine in your modern Chrome browser or whatever now. So where does environmental sustainability come in? I'm here talking with you all today because I co-authored a paper in 2019 that was published in the American Archivist with Keith Pendergrass, Walker Sampson, and Laura Alanya, called Toward Environmentally Sustainable Digital Preservation. The DOI link and a tiny URL that's a little easier to remember are down there if anyone wants to go check the paper out. And so I'm kind of going to summarize some of the things in the paper, update a little bit of information as I go. So the starting point for our research was that there was no quantitative research at the time on the complete environmental effects of digital preservation practices. There were definitely some articles that not only informed but inspired us to write this paper that were kind of calling for this. But we decided it was worth taking a look to see, like, do a proper literature review, see what we could find, see how environmental sustainability was even being talked about, if at all, by the field, things like that. We know that digital preservation practice relies on information and communication technology, computers, phones, networks, all of that kind of stuff. And we know that that has an impact, so we want to know what that impact is. And we know that digital preservation safeguards are costly. Keeping 3+ copies of data means you're replicating the amount of data that you're being stored hugely, which must increase the carbon footprint and also our bills, right? And integrity checks, checking checksums, in the traditional way that we usually do it, is computationally expensive and uses a lot of network bandwidth, especially if you're doing this in a cloud environment, because what you have to do is read through every single byte in that file to calculate the hash for that file and then compare it against a stored known value that we had. But that means that entire file has to go over the network and that entire file has to be read, which when you're talking about tons and tons, like petabytes of data, gets really expensive really fast. There are other technologies that can help with this that do it, for example, at the file system layer or at the hardware layer instead of a file by file layer, and we can use those to help. If anyone has questions about that, I'd be happy to nerd out about it in further detail. Things like ZFS are like promising, but don't entirely erase this problem either. So we started looking at what the impact of ICT technology is. And it turns out it's very substantial. The cloud is very material, as I said. There are different estimates, but I found that in general, global greenhouse emissions from the tech sector are comparable to or higher than the aviation industry, somewhere between 2 and 3.5% of global emissions, depending on the stats that you're looking at. And data centers are, as the second quote says, a Russian doll of redundancies. Most of the power is not actually used for actively powering the servers. It's used for cooling those servers, whether through air conditioning or liquid cooling systems, and keeping tons of redundant fail-safe systems, things like battery backups, backup servers, whatever, online and ready to go so that there isn't downtime. When AWS says that they have the how many 7 nines guarantee or whatever, they're able to do that. They're able to say your site will never be down, your files will always be accessible because they have all these redundant systems in place that all have their own impact. Typical data centers also tend to require hundreds of thousands of gallons or millions of gallons of water a day, and at least in North America are often in places where drought conditions are becoming more and more of a reality, places like California, Arizona. So as time goes on, this is going to be probably more and more of a problem, right? But the impact of ICT is not just powering those servers. That's the easiest thing to talk about, and that's what comes out, that's often what they measure in their impact reports at cloud companies. But much of the environmental and human costs of ICT actually come before and after that, from resource extraction, refining, manufacturing, transportation, and disposal. And when we consider this full life cycle, that leads us to what we call the embodied cost. So just to give a sort of example, Circular Computing in 2021 found that the manufacturing of a laptop is about 75 to 85% of its overall carbon footprint, compared to the remaining 15 or 20% that would actually be its use over however many years. And then the average laptop had a total carbon footprint of about 331 kilograms of CO2. A lot of that coming from the motherboard, SSD, and display. For servers, there may not be displays, but you better believe that the motherboard, SSD, and other components still require tons of water to be produced, tons of earth to be mined, rare earth minerals that are found largely in China, but also all over the world. Yeah, so not only is there this carbon footprint, they also, for a single laptop takes almost 200,000 liters of water and 1,200 kilograms of earth mined. It's a pretty serious impact. Just to give you some visual examples, resource extraction, this is the Bel Air open pit mine in Guinea. We can talk about cobalt, especially for electric vehicles and lithium batteries. Being mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo under absolutely inhumane conditions. These sorts of things are happening all over the world. There's refining and industrial processes. So this is just an example of metal casting at the Reliance Foundry in Canada. But we have to actually take those metals out, turn them into something else, right? And then they go into the actual electronic component manufacturing, which again, the average kind of semiconductor facility, remember, requires like millions of gallons of water every day, as well as, you know, the power to run that. Then we have shipping. If the actual minerals are coming from, say, Guinea and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and then going to like China for refinement and transportation, and then they come to Canada as the finished laptop, and that's a grossly simplified version of that chain. You also have things like big container ships that are have their own environmental impact. And e-waste disposal, which is pretty brutal, to be honest. This is a picture from Gaza, from where they burn e-waste, laptop servers, whatever, to get to the reusable and or like valuable rare earth metals that are inside, which creates terrible environmental conditions, unsafe work conditions, and go on, but I think you get the idea. So in the paper, we recommended two things. One is that we try to reduce our unsustainability by making smart choices, right? We should pick cloud providers and data centers that run on clean energy, that are trying to provide back to their communities the water that they use. And we can try to schedule tasks if we're using local servers, for instance, to run at off-peak hours so that we don't overload the electrical grid. But all of those things are just sort of minimizing our impact a little bit. They're not actually a move towards a more sustainable future. And what we thought is that that move towards sustainability is really going to come by drawing on familiar older archival principles. So one is focusing on high-value materials by re-emphasizing appraisal and selection. Simply put, the less we keep, the lower our impact. Reducing the resource intensity of digital storage by rethinking digital permanence a little bit. We tend to think that because we can do all this computationally expensive stuff, to make sure that our files never corrupt, that we should do that to everything. And I think there's a professional calling often to like see a best practice and always want to hit it, right? But that might not actually be appropriate for everything. We might have some really high value assets that deserve multiple copies, regular fixity checking, things like that. And we might have other materials that might degrade a little bit, and that's okay. We never talked about permanence with physical archives. We talked about managing degradation or managing the effects of time. And we might need to start thinking about digital things in those terms as well. So we kind of pushed for people to think about tier levels of effort, where you categorize the material you're managing by tiers of value, and you apply practices that match those tiers of value. Maybe you have a subset that is really, really important cultural gems. Absolutely do everything for those. Maybe some of our day-to-day office documents, we can do a little bit less. We can have one backup. And meet user needs in different ways by challenging some assumptions about everything being available online immediately all the time, because we know that that has a cost. If we are putting everything in a digital repository and we want to meet our modern user expectations of people being able to stream a video right away, or like look at that image right away, or whatever, then we're going to have to run all of the technology to make that happen. We could look into having like tiered storage systems where we keep our stuff in a cold storage system and someone requests it and it's available a day later, and that might minimize our impact. Or we might say, we'll be able to email that to you and save us a bunch of servers and kind of streaming software and the impacts of those. In the 5 years since the paper, I'm glad to say that there's been a lot of conversation and movement forward. This is a screenshot of the Digital Preservation Coalition's preservation policy toolkit, where essentially this is a tool that's widely referred to when organizations are creating their digital preservation policies. They have, in the year since, added sections on sustainability, asking people to actually consider the environmental impact of their work. And that's made its way into a bunch of policies, from the Postal Museum to the Northwestern Libraries, the British Geological Survey. We're seeing more and more people explicitly thinking about the environmental impact when they're creating their policies and their digital preservation strategies, which is great. This is just a small sample of some of the blog posts that have been explicitly about environmental preservation, environmental impacts of digital preservation and environmentally sustainable digital preservation. which is really cool. We can see like, it's getting more and more talked about as time goes on. A number of institutions have started doing the work of calculating their carbon footprint and how to minimize it, which is fantastic. So these are examples here from archives in Finland and the Netherlands. I know the National Archives in the UK, the University of Houston in the United States have also done similar work and published their results, which is great. And people are starting to think about, not just the storage, but also like what we keep. So I work in web archiving, right? And one thing that is really annoying when you're doing web archiving is that often when you're running crawlers to actually capture the web archives, the way it usually works is you start at a seed URL and then it goes and looks for the links and then it kind of crawls out through the rest of the website from there, right? You can get caught in things called crawler traps, where maybe a website just links to itself endlessly, but with different query parameters. So you end up capturing like 50,000 versions of the same page that you never needed to begin with. There are ways to catch that. And so this is a post from the National Archives in the UK, where they started using regular expressions to try to catch these crawler traps. And it resulted in a crawl that was like 100 and, it's off the top of my head, so don't quote me here, but over 100 gigabytes with the crawler traps to something that was 4 gigabytes when they actually did the work to make sure that they were only capturing what they wanted. This is something we're very aware of in our tools as well at Webrecorder. So in browser tricks, this is the reason why we show a live queue as well as screencasts of what all the browsers are capturing in real time and allow you to dynamically add exclusions. If you're like, no, I don't need timeanddate.com. You can just add that real quick and it'll stop crawling websites that match. And we found it makes the crawls faster, it makes the resulting web archive smaller, and everyone's happy, right? I'll leave you a couple parting thoughts. In terms of practical advice, don't fear compression. Anything that we can do that's reasonable to keep our footprint down, we should do. I think there was a time where in digital preservation we saw compression as its own sort of risk for long-term sustainability. But if you're using a common compression algorithm, really don't think that's true. And especially if you have safeguards in place, like if you're doing regular checks to make sure your files haven't corrupted, then we don't really need to mitigate the risk of our files corrupting at the same time, right? That's like overly redundant probably. Think about delaying preservation actions like format migration until they're actually necessary, instead of doing that, all of that, like when you take the files into your digital archive, say it's a docx file, people might want to like put it into a more open format or whatever. Really see if that's necessary or if that's basically just doubling your footprint for kind of minimal gains. If we're doing environmental monitoring of when file formats go obsolete, then maybe we can do that like at the point of access or at the point that it becomes necessary, not now thinking that it might be necessary in 10 or 15 years time. I also have thoughts like file formats don't go obsolete except in niche cases like CAD as often as we think they do. I could talk forever, but I won't. Don't feel that you need to give everything the same treatment, and be especially careful with video. So I'm seeing 2 cameras here that are recording footage at, I assume, a very high resolution, which is fantastic. But those are going to create massive files. And if whoever is preserving this decided, okay, we're going to keep the raw, we're going to keep the version that was streamed online, we're going to keep the intermediary copy, and we're going to keep all of that in triplicate, right? Then that footprint becomes massive. And if you're a movie studio or a production studio or an artist who's going to go rework that raw footage into something later, then maybe you do want to keep a couple of those layers. But for most of us, honestly, like an MP4 that's H.264 encoded, that's basically the YouTube standard, is probably fine for most things and is going to be like compressed and quite a bit smaller. Similarly, if you're taking things off of a format that's already not that high quality, like if we're taking something off of a VHS tape, you really don't have to make that an uncompressed, like huge video file that you're storing because the quality was kind of crappy to begin with. It's fine, we can leave it at the quality that it was. And the hot takes. Resist the AI hype train. There are real good, useful applications of AI technology like machine learning, like deep learning, whatever, there's also a lot of hype. And these models have a hugely significant environmental impact, both in their training and in their application. So maybe make sure that you have a well-considered kind of practical application for these technologies before using them, instead of like applying a tool because some vendor was like, ooh, we have the magic AI software now, which I think we all know in a lot of cases is kind of snake oil. There's an overlap of environmental and ethical concerns that I think in a world of increasing conflict, like part of caring about the environment is caring about the people who are pushing for us to be better against the fossil fuel industry and other kind of harms. We don't want to make the video, especially that we keep, something that gets used as a technology of control by the state against the people who are actually pushing for things to be better. And this is in my mind because there were examples of this during the Black Lives Matter protests after the killing of George Floyd and too many other people a few years back, where people were really pushing for like, this is a historically important event. We need to capture all of the video we can. We need to keep it in archives forever, and we should make it available like on the Internet Archive, for instance. The problem is that when you make that available, that also becomes available to the people who are trying to repress these activists and keep those systems of repression going. And like, oops, we accidentally contributed to the deaths of people who are fighting for a better world. We don't want to be doing that. So just think about how these concerns are all sort of interrelated. And finally, I know we all, especially at universities, there are a lot of like older digital humanities projects or like personal projects or whatever, where we created a thing that was really cool, maybe as part of a grant, and it's still running somewhere on a server with a database. And it's becoming a problem because it's out of date, it's hard to security patch that server, but also it's kind of wasteful to just have these servers running all the time for like an older project. You can get creative. As a web archivist and a creator of web archiving tools, maybe think about like serving a web archive on demand instead. So we partnered with Stanford University Press to do this for some of their older projects, just as an example, where they have a number of projects that were really interesting, but are static, right? There's no more content being added. So instead of continuing to serve that as it was, we can create a high fidelity web archive of it, host that as a single zip file, basically, a WAXI file somewhere, and serve a static site like on a CDN that has a much lower impact. And the way that this technology works, if you're embedding this web archive using our WAXI format, is that the whole web archive never has to get loaded. We only do range requests to get the data that that user needs at that exact moment, which means the whole operation of serving this older project to people not only becomes a lot more sustainable from like a maintenance perspective, but also has a much lower environmental impact. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tessa. So now let me introduce you to our last speaker, who is Dr. Pedro Peres-Neto. He is a professor here at Concordia University in the Department of Biology. He's also holds the Canada Research Chair in Spatial Ecology and Biodiversity. He leveraging an extensive array of digital infrastructure such as computational methods and data repositories. His research aims to uncover the ecological and evolutionary mechanisms that drive variation in biodiversity across various spatial and temporal scales, ranging from local to global. With over 20 years of experience, Dr. Peres-Neto has served on several editorial boards of diverse journals in the field of ecology and evolution. The current publication system heavily relies on digital technology, with Dr. Peres-Neto actively contributing to the development of strategies within this domain. So, thank you.
All right, I don't think I have much left to say after, that's the danger. You always have the last word, but you don't have much to say. So anyways, so what I'm gonna do here today is I'm gonna talk to you about this two-way street, right? So digital resources, they challenge sustainability ideologies, but also digital information and content can help, with sustainable policies and ways to make sure that we have ways to continue using our resources in some sort of decent manner. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use research, which is my field, but I'm going to sprinkle around a lot of anecdotes that probably everyone will feel comfortable in saying, okay, I do this is good. I do that, that's not good. The last thing I want to say is that, it's clear from the presentations, and I'm going to continue here, is that we spend more time generating data than actually organizing it. And this is a huge issue. And this is particularly with redundance, and my field is no different. Probably researchers are horrible that way. So this is an idea of, how we think about, amounts of data, right? So in 2013, the entire amount of information that humanity had created could be contained in what is 0.5 zettabytes. In 2025, we'll need about the weight of 50 million humans today to storage 175 zettabytes. So I made this calculation making some assumptions, right, based on the average human adult weight and so on. But that gives you this idea that, that's a lot of data. And that's not counting a lot of data that we don't actually know that exist. And that's not counting the energy that is necessary for cooling all the servers and so on. But that gives you more or less where we're going with this. And once we run out of zettabytes, we're gonna go to yottabytes, but that will take a decade or so to get there, right? All right. So as you can see, digital data is increasing exponentially. We learned that. The problem is that we need to understand exponents are different, right? This is a mathematical concept. So when you say increasing exponents, there are different speeds in which those exponents are increasing, and data is a big one. So the challenges of data storage and modernizing digital infrastructure, that's basically another challenge, is because, when I started my PhD, barely email and internet were not actually properly available. And I remember, I just finally got rid of not finally, I say 10 years ago, about my floppy disks that I saved thousands of them through my research, which, now we actually have waste that we can actually decompose that kind of material. We didn't have that 20 years ago. So one of the things is not only the problem of storage data, the other challenge is modernizing this infrastructure that will continue to have to change. Everyone wants an electric car, which I think is great, but what are we gonna do with the billions of cars that are running now? So that's the kind of discussion. I don't want to put a value on, or a moral value or ethics on this, but that's for you to do, but you can see where we go with this. One of the things biology is going to bring is modernizing this. So you may not know, but there is today technology that we can actually save data in DNA. DNA is the most compressed format you can find. So this is just an idea here that gives you how we can transform actually digital files, convert in binary language, convert in DNA sequence, and store that. I'll give an example. The 175 zettabytes that exist on the planet, more or less, 150 zettabytes can be actually saved in the entire human genome of one individual. So that's the future. The future. And there are companies now developing this technology that actually are able. The problem is very expensive. It's very expensive to go from this to this to this to this and then go back. So it will take a few decades, but we'll get there. And hopefully that's going to take care of the entire issue of storage data. So that's a biological solution for you. As a biologist, I find fascinating that actually we can bring that to humanity in many ways, but it will take time. It will take time. Internet use over time, we all know this. This is particularly bad in research. I'm gonna give you a few examples where individual behavior can actually make a difference, and that applies to everyone, a researcher or not. We know that digital, the way digital is distributed is not fully democratic, meaning there's a lot of people that don't have access to internet, to computers, to phones, and so on. And I think that's an important issue at the same time. We want everyone to have access to everything, right? And so this is the distribution of global digital carbon footprint. Tessa gave a really good coverage on these things, but you know, if you think about smartphones and computers are about there, you know, use of terminals is 38%. Huh? It's actually huge compared to computers, but this is the usage of computers. This is not putting the production of the computers themselves in there, but you can see that we're spending a lot. I want to talk to you about, you know, those individual actions. I remember many years ago, I don't know if you remember this, people, how do we save water from an individual point of view? You put a bottle or bricks, right, in your water reservoir of your toilet, you're gonna save water. You can do that too. In the same way of thinking that you can make those individual decisions, you can make those individual decisions for you. So for instance, we now know that different web browsers, for instance, different software, different types of computers, different operation systems, different ways in which you actually manage your own personal use of computers will make a huge impact. I keep telling my students, but they keep using some of those browsers. I'm not gonna name names because I've been recorded, but you can see that. And some of those browsers, not even clear depending on the setup that you're making. Every time you open, have you noticed that people now have 50 or 60 sort of pages open? And every time it's not clear whether you actually reloading those pages or not. It depends on the setups that you have. So people are not aware of those things. And I think universities, particularly because we have millions of people that actually will take on the work work market in the future, I think the role of institutions is not only, it's about educating people too from those small solutions. But we can think about large scale actions that can make a difference, right? So a lot of research, and that is true for a lot of companies, right? What we have is those big servers. I'm at fault, I have a lot of them. I still have my own servers that you actually run. That's not actually very efficient, right? So Canada has this infrastructure now for quite a bit of time, the Calcul Canada or Calcul Québec. And so this is a consortium, the West Grid, which serves UBC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and I think Manitoba as well. So there are those different centralized grids. This is a much better way because you have experts and technicians that will take care of all the redundant parts, it will take care of all the cooling systems, and so on. Maybe sending all those servers to Greenland wouldn't be a bad idea in terms of saving energy, and there's a lot of them actually. People are thinking, Google has a lot of servers going to colder countries in some ways. So one of the problems that we have today, I keep saying this, and in research this is particularly true, but it's true for everyone, is to find it. We invested a lot in generating data. We didn't invest as much as organizing it and actually searching. You may think Google is very efficient, but it isn't actually in some ways. I mean, there are ways in which you can think about organizing data from individual point of view and from institutional point of view. This could be in itself this could be a book in itself. But you know, one have to think about not only volume, but variety, the speed in which you find this data, and veracity, right? So how much accuracy you can actually have on that data. So one of the things that is very important, and that creates, this is where researchers live, and policy, and sociologists, and politicians, and so on. But one thing is data. Data are raw, unprocessed facts alone that may not convey a clear meaning whereas information is data that has been organized and processed. So from data, you go to information. By the way, sometimes you have more information about, that information takes more space than actually the data that was used to generate that information itself. You know, the graphs that you generate out of those, the content that you generate out of those, all this. So data is one thing, information comes from data, but information takes space. And then you have evidence, which is specifically pertains to information or data that supports conclusion and demonstrates a fact within a particular context. So policymakers and politicians, and you know, a lot of research is today based on this idea of evidence-based research, right? That we need to compound information to actually say there is evidence that climate change is true. I think there's more than evidence, it is absolutely true. And is human derived, by the way. So one of the things I want to talk to you today that institutions can do is this idea of open scholarship. Open scholarship, it's this practice in which actually you made data, information, and evidence available to everyone, okay? And I think research is a place where we do a lot of this, but certainly there are think tanks around the world. Google certainly has their divisions, or many other companies, on information and evidence and so on, right? So sustainable research through open scholarship data is today, actually passed a long time ago, it passed the value of oil. You can think data today as the most important commodity in the world, okay? It costs money to generate, but it generates often far more money than actually what it costs to be generated, right? So open scholarship, you have this components of open access, right? That we should share things. Open research, that we share not only the data, but we share our results. And open education, making education more accessible to everyone. So all these components are part of open scholarship. By the way, we have a group at Concordia that is dedicated, a task group on open scholarship. So this is an ongoing project for about 2-3 years. So we prioritize the openness of academic research and scholarship, but I think this, again, you can sprinkle this into many corners of society that are important to generate. Like companies are generating information all the time. So it reduces research costs. One of the things that is important is data sometimes are generated. I don't know that person generated that data, but I could use that data to do something else. Instead of spending money to regenerate that data, why not using that data? Right? So that's another aspect of open scholarship, is that it's not only about saving the data, but it's avoiding generating that data to begin with. And this comes hand in hand with this idea of organizing data. If data are not organized, we don't know that exists. And then we're gonna go and regenerate again over and over and over again. And so that also reduces environmental footprint. And improves research quality, right? So database and data infrastructure are the base of open science, have important environmental impacts. We covered this. You know, materials, carbon emissions, and unsustainable practices. And I think Tessa really covered this quite well. I'm gonna give you one example of my own field, but this applies. Why sharing data? Why sharing resources? So today we know biodiversity is an important component of humanity, including for human health. And one way is to understand how global changes in our environment are affecting biodiversity globally is by sharing biodiversity information that is collected here in your backyard or in large research programs, but we collate all this data and we built databases that are organized so that people can find where that species is, how many of those individuals, and so on through time. And obviously, there are a lot of push for this idea of integration information systems, that you integrate information systems into blocks of important data that you think for a particular problem. Biodiversity is no different. This is just an example of the global climate and weather data that is available, basically publicly. People can know and have predictions about the future of climate change and so on, but we don't have that for many other systems. So physicists and environmental people that have been generating those models to predict the future and understand the past of climate change. They have those common infrastructure and resources. We have many examples of citizen science that actually generates quite a bit of data. One of them is the North American Breeding Bird Survey, where about 2,500 birders across North America, a big chunk of North America, it's expensive to come here, right? That they generated this data since 1960s. And a lot of this data is used to redo research and is all organized by the USGS in the US. This is an important point here too. And this activity in itself, which is an environmental activity, generates data, but it fuels $75 billion in wildlife watching industry. So there's some touristic involved in that. Therefore, generating data also generate all kinds of other issues too. Generating data is not cheap in environmental issues. So this is a paper we published a while ago. This idea of some advantages of judicial scholarship, reduce the time associated with data handling and a better version controlling of the data, prevention of duplication of effort, insurance to protect against loss, less time and effort to retrieve data, helping solve the reproducibility crisis. Those are not familiar with reproducibility crisis, the fact that let's say you run an experiment and someone on the other side of the planet decides to run exactly the same experiment. They may not actually get the same results. And there are many explanations for that, right? So training tools and data sets for students. So Open Scholarship also have those data that are publicly available and so on. So digital open scholarship from observation to data usage, that's also an important component. One of the things that we didn't touch too much, we talked a lot about storage, but we didn't talk so much about computational. So you could have very small data, and that data, let's say I want to generate a model to understand the nature of the processes that are underlying that data. That model could take months to run using RAM and energy, but not actually using storage. So another aspect of that research involves, and not only research, but there are many other groups across the world, is that the costs are sometimes, it's not so much physical, but it's also the energy that goes into RAM, and RAM has to be then, goes obsolete and goes and so on. The other problem that I touched on is the challenges is to find the data. So this is a piece that we wrote a little while ago. Ecological data should not be so hard to find and reuse, but it is. And then you have repositories of repositories, which is a funny concept, right? So you have Data One, which is an NSF, the National Science Foundation in the US, that generates this repository of repositories of repositories of repositories. So more redundance, and it's, there are some glitches. I don't want to talk too much about Data One because there are tons of those examples, but again, more redundance. And the fact that we don't find information. I think a lot of the redundancy that we have is also created by the fact that we don't have perfect search systems, right? So the other thing too is this idea that journals now, so journals, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of journals, right, across all fields, science, medicine, and so on, sociology, anthropology, political science, and goes on. So journals are starting to mandate data archiving. The other problem we have is that, think about this, some group generated data 20 years ago. The data disappeared. It wasn't properly curated by the institution or by the researchers, right? So what happens to that data? Someone will have to eventually regenerate that data again because it wasn't properly, and that is experiments, time of students, time of researchers, computers, and so on. So redundancy can be saved also by proper curation. So for instance, I heard there's a Canadian university, I can't remember which one, that in their faculty collective agreement actually states that they have to use proper standards for archiving data. That's a huge one. The amount of people that retire and they take their data to the grave is not small. So we need to find ways, and I think libraries, we discuss a lot of this. I wrote particularly this section on how libraries can help in this idea of technology-oriented age, right? So the other problem too that is a change in behavior. So a lot of people like to create content. That's people out there, and we researchers do create content, but we're not so good at actually making that content available to others. There are many reasons. Some people think they're going to make a lot of money out of patents, right? And so they're going to keep all their data. Some people don't want to have what we call scoops, right? That I generated 10 years to generate that data. I archive somewhere, some group that it has far more money to pay people to write papers and analyze data. In 3 months, they come out of a paper that took 10 years for me to generate, but I don't have that power. So there's a lot of behavior, right? So what happens at the end is that I think there's a change of behavior here in research that we should go conserve first and share later. Many people don't want to share. I want to share everything. But a lot of people, but Pedro, you also use a lot of those shared resources. Yes, right. But the issue is that a lot of people, because they think that proper curation and conservation will lead to sharing, they don't actually put the time to conserve. And that creates this conundrum, right? So the other thing that I think we will need is training. So a lot of people don't know actually to archive, they don't know archiving data. Tessa used the term metadata or data dictionaries, right? Some people use this different things, but the majority of people that actually generate content in research and otherwise, they do not understand that how do you actually proper archive that data that can be used for the future, right? And this generates a conundrum, not only for institutions, librarians, but linguists too in the future. We're having an early conversation, how people will communicate that actually you have atomic residues 50,000 years from now, where we know the majority of the languages that we speak today might not actually be existing in the future. So we need symbolic systems, right? So a lot of people in computational linguists, they're thinking about how we're going to be able to actually communicate information in the future, because languages will eventually disappear and appear, right? So floppy disks disappear, hard disks from the past are disappearing, and we're evolving. But digital information is evolving, but human languages and the way we communicate is evolving as well. So we need to be aware that training is probably one of these ways that we're going to be able at short-term scales to pass this information over and over and over, right? The other challenge is to put all this data together. So we have a lot of data, we have a lot of information, but how do you combine this in a way that you generate actually information and evidence? So I think generative language models, one of them being ChatGPT and other AI systems, and there are all kinds of mathematical and statistical ways in which people can agree or disagree and how and so on. But we need to actually, the good thing is that having all this data available, we can actually put all these people together in a way that we can go from data to information to evidence, right? And so I want to close with this, the importance of digital open scholarship to society and community. So we know that digital open scholarship affects not only research, but it affects governments, societies, economy, academia, policy, and local communities. So we know more now the value of research involves data, involves all the challenges that we discussed. And I want to close with this, the needs, again, we need institutional frameworks, we need universities, we need research institutes, we need think tanks, we need governments to actually, and communities that are organized at that level to provide frameworks. And if they don't have, sometimes the worst problem is not how to do it, is that people don't know that that is a problem. And that's another concern that I have. And I think just because even in universities, I teach hundreds of students every year, and I'm surprised by the fact that most students never thought that this web browser consumes more energy than that one. So not even thinking, and they use web browsers every single day of their lives. So that's an interesting component. So as software, we'll need to rethink over and over about technological infrastructure. I'm hoping that storaging in DNA will be actually the future, and I'll probably, unfortunately, either be retired or dead by the time this is a reality of day to day, but you know, it's good. And a cultural change from individual behavior to institutional. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, all speakers. It was very, very interesting presentations. So now we are at the period of questions. So I don't know if we have already questions in the chat that maybe we can start with. Oh, maybe we can start with
Oui,
people.
on a une question dans le chat. Quelle est la place de la formation des employés, considérant que beaucoup de collègues ont des difficultés avec les numériques?
Avec la technologie numérique.
Could you please repeat the question?
Oui.
I think.
Quelle est la place de la formation des employés, considérant que beaucoup de collègues ont des difficultés avec le numérique? Yeah, there we go.
C'est ça.
C'est une question pour nous, ça?
C'est pour tout le monde. Pour tout le monde. Hein? Vas-y.
Ben, peut-être une première partie de la réponse à cette question, c'est qu'effectivement, on fait des formations qui sont adaptées au public que l'on vise, donc des choses assez simples, puis on y va crescendo, là. Donc, ça serait ça, ma réponse de petit à petit sensibiliser, former les gens au numérique selon le niveau d'où ils partent. Je ne sais pas si tu veux rajouter quelque chose.
Bien, c'est sûr, certain que la formation est importante pour les utilisateurs, mais c'est, tu sais, on le voit tout, ce qu'on a vu en ce moment, c'est un comportement aussi qu'on doit amener à éduquer le monde, à se poser la question sur comment utiliser sa donnée. Est-ce qu'elle est importante ou y donner une durée de vie? Fait que c'est oui, la formation, oui, est importante. J'ai un peu de misère à bien donner une réponse sur ce point-là, parce que j'avoue que ça m'embête un peu comme
peut-être tout ce que je présentais comme communication, web diffusion qu'on peut faire à l'interne ou quand on va parler aux employés directement, on essaye, c'est ça, de sensibiliser les personnes petit à petit, donc d'y aller par de là où partent les employés pour les monter en compétences par rapport à ça.
Si je peux ajouter quelque chose, c'est primordial la formation parce que les gens sont vraiment pas au même niveau technologique. Puis comme disait le docteur Peres-Neto un petit peu plus tôt, les gens sont pas du tout au courant de comment ils consomment, de quelle valeur a la consommation de des documents numériques ou des différentes plateformes. Donc je pense que c'est primordial. Est-ce que vous voulez ajouter quelque chose?
I'm going to answer this obliquely because I think in my case, like the thinking about not just employees, but just broadly, I think it's really important that we educate people to look beyond kind of commercially convenient metaphors for the digital infrastructure that we live in. If you think about the cloud, intuitive interfaces, there's a lot of metaphors that we use popularly that were brought forward by companies to make money, right? Because it's convenient for us to think like, poof, the files go up there and I don't need to think about them anymore. My iPhoto library, like I don't ever have to delete a photo again. I can all just live up there somehow and it just conveniently comes to my phone. And these metaphors were brought forward for reasons, which is it's not, the commercial interests here are opposed to the environmental interests and like an informed citizenry, I think. If we think about electric vehicles too, it's kind of the same, right? If we replace every gas guzzling car with an EV, we have new environmental problems. We're gonna have to gut entire countries for the amount of cobalt that we need. The footprint of manufacturing all of those batteries and replacing them periodically is gonna be huge. So I think it's really important to go past the way that we talk about it at a high level socially to the details to have like meaningful conversations about these sorts of things. And yeah, whether you're an employee, whether you're just like a citizen who's going to go vote in an election, whether you're thinking about your personal choices, it's really important. And like on that note, as a footprint, when we're looking at carbon footprints, like I said, the embodied cost of ICT technology is much more than its active use. But if you look at what like cloud providers self-report their carbon footprints to be, it's almost entirely the active use. They're almost never reporting the actual full footprint, which is like can be orders of magnitude higher, or at least is significantly higher. When they say they're 100% carbon neutral too, most of the time that means we buy carbon credits equivalent to the electricity that we use, which is not the same thing as actually using clean energy to begin with, because there are problems with those carbon offsets. It doesn't actually balance out except in an economic sense.
Donc, je vais utiliser l'exemple des universités au Canada, mais aussi on pourrait penser ça comme un système de... Je vois les petits à petits comme quelque chose pour la sensibilisation, mais je pense qu'il marche très lentement. Donc, pour moi, je pense qu'il y a des politiques internes des institutions. Aujourd'hui, par exemple, on fait à Concordia, mais c'est des politiques provinciales. La majorité des universités au Canada, la majorité, non, toutes sont c'est la province qui génère souvent des politiques, sauf par des fonds fédéraux. Mais le cas, c'est qu'on a des formations obligatoires aujourd'hui. Les étudiants sont obligés à prendre certaines formations, tous les étudiants. Juste à Concordia, 150 000. Hein. Et tous les employés et tous les membres du corps professoral, etc. Donc, moi, regarde, quand on voit des films là, et des séries de télé les années 70, que les gens, ils conduisent des voitures sans utiliser un ceinture, ils fumaient des cigarettes dans des hôpitaux. Ça nous frappe aujourd'hui de voir ça, mais c'était juste une loi là, qui a fait ça. Hein? C'est une loi. Ça a changé d'un jour. Ça a pris quelques mois pour s'adapter. Mais 5 ans plus tard, je suis sûr que les gens, ils étaient frappés par avoir des images comme ça. Et on est encore frappés. Ben aujourd'hui, on trouve drôle. On n'est plus frappé de voir des gens qui fument des cigarettes dans des hôpitaux. Mais cette sorte d'anecdote, c'est pour raconter que je pense que les institutions et même des compagnies qui sont gérées par les gouvernements, comme Hydro-Québec, la SAQ, etc., la SAQ, on voit là, je vais faire un commentaire, la quantité de trucs qui sont imprimés, la quantité de données qui sont gardées. Je suis même pas sûr s'il y a une organisation de gestion interne. Et ça, il sert tous les Québécois. Donc, je pense qu'à un moment, il faut créer des rapports pour savoir où les problèmes sont et après, vraiment, générer des politiques internes des institutions qui disent, regarde, il faut qu'on va suivre ça et il faut investir sur l'éducation. L'éducation, c'est pas les temps, si je suis un employé ou un étudiant, il faut trouver les temps nécessaires pour que les gens, c'est pas que je vais à la maison là dans mon temps personnel. Il faut vraiment faire un investissement institutionnel et je pense que le gouvernement, spécialement au Canada, est privilégié parce que la majorité des universités et toutes au Québec sont un système de public, comme on dit par guillemets. Mais je pense que la solution des petits à petits, ça va prendre trop de temps. Je pense qu'il faut vraiment faire la chose là.
Do we have a question in the chat?
Oui, ils sont affichés juste là. Es-tu prêt à répondre ou veux-tu que je réponde sur celle-là?
Donc, pour Hydro-Québec, vous dites politique de gestion du cycle de vie de l'information et de la donnée. Est-ce que ça signifie que vous avez formellement, clairement intégré les données au calendrier de conservation? Quels sont les changements que la politique a connus? Est-ce que cela a amélioré la compréhension des utilisateurs sur la conservation des données par rapport à celle de l'information des documents?
Sur ce point-là, ce que je peux rajouter, c'est vraiment qu'on commence à parler à l'intérieur, de faire parler les TI et les gens de la gestion documentaire ensemble. Je peux dire, c'est dans les débuts. On a justement un département qui est la gestion, la gouvernance de données. On a des politiques de rétention qui ont été données par la BANQ ou tout ça. On doit garder certaines informations. Mais justement, c'est que ces politiques-là, soit qui sont mal communiquées à l'intérieur d'Hydro-Québec, et aussi, il faut qu'on les adapte à l'information ou digitale. Parce que ce que je veux dire par là, c'est on a une politique de conservation de données. Je donne par exemple, là, elle est fictive, cette politique-là, mais genre, tous les journaux des systèmes doivent être gardés pendant 18 ans. Là, tu fais, attends une minute, là, c'est parce que si tu parles de tous les données, de tous les systèmes, c'est 18 ans, ben, voici l'impact technologique que tu as en arrière. Là, après ça, c'est une fois qu'on dit, ben, regarde, écoute, tu vas générer des pétabytes de données. Est-ce qu'on doit revoir cette politique-là ou peut-être l'adapter? Moi, je suis du côté infrastructure. Moi, on a comme un carré de sable qu'on doit garder. Et ces politiques-là permettent justement de jouer, de délimiter le carré de sable, puis que ce qu'on peut mettre à l'intérieur ou ce que je dois investir en technologie ou en infrastructure. Fait que, pour te dire, est-ce qu'elle est formellement et clairement intégrée dans les données du calendrier de conservation? Je pense que ça va être quelqu'un d'Hydro-Québec qui doit poser cette question-là. À mon point de vue, en ce moment, c'est embryonnaire. On a tout ça, on est en train de le faire. Il y en a des politiques, mais moi, ça m'a pris quasiment 3 ans avant de trouver c'est quoi cette politique-là et à partir de quoi je peux jouer pour pouvoir justement continuer à faire mon travail et offrir toujours le service en infrastructure. Est-ce que ça répond à ta question, Carole?
Parfait, merci. Donc, la prochaine question. This is a question for Tessa. Are these measures that can be implemented right now via policies and best practices to reduce the environmental footprint in terms of energy and water consumptions?
Yeah. I mean, I think the simplest possible version of this answer is do and keep less. If we spend more time in the appraisal and selection of what we're going to preserve up front and in what format, and we take the time, because it can be overwhelming, right? Like the way that archives worked in the past, typically, is that people or organizations of note would conduct their activities. At some point past the prime of those activities, say a person passed away or retired and was thinking about their legacy, they or their family would contact an archive and say, like, maybe these papers should be available to the public for research, right? But that might happen 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, in some cases much later down the road. When our information is predominantly digital, we don't really have that affordance. If we wait that long, a lot of loss is almost certainly guaranteed to have happened. So we tend to take things earlier, and given the deluge of digital data that's being created, it's really easy to say, well, we'll store it for now and deal with it later. I think the best thing that we can do is to take in less, but take it in better. If we put that effort up front in staffing, in humans making good judgments about what we keep and how, that's going to have a massive impact. The other thing we can do is to evaluate the technology that we're using. If you are able to keep some copies in offline storage, things like LTO tape, that tends to have a much lower impact. If you're going to look into cloud computing and you have options, sometimes there are institutional policies and you just have to use what you have to use, right? But if you have options, go and do a little bit of research. Compare, Google Cloud Platform versus AWS versus Azure versus smaller places like OVH, which, has a lot of data centers in Quebec. So, at least the power is coming from hydroelectric, clean energy. There are tons of other providers. At Webrecorder, for our hosting, hosted version of BrowserTrix, we tend to use DigitalOcean. But our main production server is in Amsterdam for several reasons, but one of them being it's an Equinix facility that's been rated as running on 100% clean energy. This information is not usually easy to find. You do have to do some digging, but it's usually out there if you look hard enough.
Good. Okay. Hi. Just touching maybe on, Tessa, you touched on this in terms of the commercial aspects of things, but what I'm curious about is how vendors specifically minimize concerns around storage capacities and so on in managing storage, and they make it seem endless because it's to their advantage because it guarantees a vendor lock-in in some respects later on. And just in terms of portability of the information to switch platforms and the amount of effort that's needed to move from one solution to another and how disruptive that is and how people work and so on. Just in terms, I'm curious about the group's comments in terms of, that the commercial interests there are really not aligned with interest of individuals or interest of organizations necessarily, and just thoughts on that front.
As Tessa said, yes, there is, because I'm dealing with a lot of vendors, and I know that giving the speech of reducing their footprint, well, I wouldn't say that they don't like it. It's a reality. But in terms of, I won't shoot the messenger or shoot the vendors. They are actually also working on having a less environmental footprint. I see storage system that we installed about 7 years ago that takes about 7, 6, or even 10 storage IT cabinets. Okay, they are massive, and we're talking about just having 2 petabytes of data into it. About 6 or 5 months ago, we started to change them. I have double the capacity, but I'm taking actually 1.5 storage cabinet. So vendors, yes, they are actually working on data densification. And we have technologies like deduplication of the data and everything like this. And they consume less energy. But yes, there's still the fact that if your data is still there and it's not even usable, you're still going to use every other resource that is water, rare earth, and everything like this, that will, yet you will have to move your data. Yes, it's a pain moving data from one vendor to the other. Vendor lock-in is possible, but there's always other technologies that you can actually set free yourself from a complete vendor lock-in. It's the same thing for cloud storage. You will do your workload on Amazon, and you want to try to move it to Azure or even Google Cloud Platform. You will have to rework almost all your information or all your system just to make sure that they will bring it. But the fact that if you know how to control your data, make sure that your data that you move or you use is not outdated or even that you are aware of, this is where you can reduce your footprint. That's my point of view. I don't know if it's answering your question, more or less. But yes, I see it in terms of IT infrastructure. Vendors are reducing their footprint because you can actually put more data into a single hard drive. And hard drives are not spindles, they are now digital, they're memories and everything like this. Moore's law is actually working in data and IT in terms of storage. Moore's law is still working to a certain limit. But, DNA, I like the DNA. If we can put every 175 zettabyte, 150 zettabyte into one user. into one human? I say, well, you know, I have a little bit of more weight, so I might hit 180 zeta. So, but that's it. Do you want to still answer or?
No, I'll take another one.
Yeah, fair. I think I'll just say to that point that first of all, the discrepancies, I don't think it's always malicious either. There's a lot of, it makes sense for companies to say to people, like, you don't have to waste your time on this anymore, right? Your time is valuable. Don't think about it. Just let all your photos go up to the cloud. And it's like, there can be motivations like vendor lock-in, but other times I think it's also just an easy sell to people who are busy and don't really want to have to think about this. On the other hand, sometimes it is, right? Like making claims like, oh, we're 100% carbon neutral because you bought a bunch of carbon offsets is kind of BS and we all know it. I don't know that there's like a clear answer here. I think one thing is that the more people that are asking these vendors hard questions about their footprints, the more they'll have to take it seriously. Like we can use the market incentives here to our advantage. And yeah, we try to use places that make it a little easier to move files around if we can, so that we can get out. But yeah, I don't know, it's tricky.
I have a question. It's not about records management, it's more about hardware. Tessa, you had a picture that's very striking, and we know about how we send our hardware abroad to be recuperated or burned. Here in Quebec, they have this sert plus à rien. I don't know how they translate it in French, but in English, but they do a lot of publicity, like bring us your hardware, your computer in Renaissance or in those places. And so I was wondering, is it shipped abroad, or do we have in Quebec something, maybe Professor, you'll have an answer being a biologist, but what are we doing with our hardware here?
I don't have an answer, but I have a lot of speculation. I will say Quebec is particularly not great when it comes to recycling. So I would be surprised they put all these efforts in recycling tech, but they can't do styrofoam and all kinds of other issues with recycling. So it's more about speculation. But one important component I feel is, I think this idea of recycling sometimes is complicated. And this comes from education and training. So for instance, have you seen the size of our recycling bins that we have in houses now? So people consume more thinking, oh, you know, they consume more thinking, oh, this is gonna get recycled. Not only it doesn't get recycled, but it sort of gives you a bill of, you know, ethical cleanliness that is actually not happening. So I think that a better way is to have ways in which you increase the longevity of the systems, right? Particularly computers, they can live forever. The problem is there's a collusion, as we know, between software developers and computer developers. I mean, the problem is the software evolves, but it starts, I mean, I don't know if you guys heard about the, Apple is being sued in the US, and in Quebec it's coming, but in parts of Canada it's already coming, in which software is generated in a way that it consumes so much more energy in your phones and so on that you decide just to change, right? You decide, well, I'm gonna give up and I'm gonna buy a new one. So there's a lot of this that I think governments are not doing enough. I think governments should be doing more. It's not just finding ways to recycle, but finding ways in which there are norms in which those, so for instance, Concordia, my computer is owned by Concordia. Concordia should have a more, and the only thing that Concordia tells, I mean, there is academic liberty, we all know these discussions, but the only thing that Concordia has in my computer is a security system. That comes with the computer. The rest, I can do whatever I want, the way I want, and so on. So I think there could be, for instance, I would love that, and there are software that actually can estimate the amount of CO2 emissions that you have for your usage of your computer. Why not installing this in institutions, in Hydro-Québec, in SAC computers, in whatever is publicly funded? It's interesting, the government, federal and provincial, they have a lot of policy for everything. So I'm not answering your question, but I'm using this to pivot another point, which is usually what I think researchers do.
I will add something on what I'm sorry about your name, Pedro, told is I always have a joke with the people that do actually the programmings, all the programmers or the dev people. Yes, you know, there's a lot of program that you just receive and you put it on a computer and your computer just lack of performance. So you're saying, well, I'm gonna buy another computer. So why we should change the other way? The guy who actually programmed the software has the slowest computer in the whole industry. And after that, if this program is actually working, it's gonna be elsewhere. It's been always a joke that I've been sending them to the dev. They say, well, you know, they come to me, they say, your infrastructure is not fast enough. While I say to them, program it that it works fast enough on the what I'm giving you, not forcing me to bring me to upgrade everything. It's a joke, but we could actually take it as a point that, and I know I'm gonna receive thousands of emails or death threats or whatever to say, every people who program have the slowest computer. If it's working on that, you know, we won't have the, what we call in English, l'obsolescence programmée. Yeah, program obsolescence. So, yeah.
As a developer, I feel this keenly. I don't know if you've noticed, but like a lot of applications on desktop computers in the last couple of years started being really bloaty and using a ton of RAM, and that's because a lot of them use something that's called Electron, that basically, instead of making a different application per operating system, right, they can basically run a web app, run it in Chrome, but on your local desktop in a way where you don't know that there's a full Chrome web browser being launched. And those apps are everywhere. So when you download an application and it's like, oh, it's 500 megabytes, and you're like, this is a client for Spotify or whatever, like, why does it have to be that big? That's why, and it's true, because it pushes us to just get faster and faster computers, and I think developers and tech companies see things like Moore's law and its equivalent of like, well, our computers are getting faster all the time, we have more storage all the time, so we don't need to think about efficiency anymore. And it might be that there's not a market reason to think about efficiency anymore, but there are plenty more like good, humane reasons that we should. And often these things line up. So I'll say at Webrecorder, right, we created a new web archiving file format. That is basically just a wrapper around the existing format. So the existing standard is called WARC. The web archive, oh no, I don't remember what it, oh yeah, it's one of those things where it's like web archive or whatever. Anyway, it's a file format that was developed out of the Internet Archive and then broadly standardized by the global community of web archivists. And it essentially just stores the network traffic of a browser, like requesting pages from the server in a plain text file that might be gzipped. The thing is, for older software that needed to replay these files, they then had to load that entire file to serve a page, even if it was only one page that you wanted. So if it was a huge work that had like 500 pages in it, but you only want to access one, a lot of times those all 500 pages worth of data would get loaded too. So what we, and by we I mean mostly Ilya Kramer, did is created a format that is basically just wrapping work files as well as some indexes and other kind of supplemental information into a zip file. Why? Because zip files support random reads. So we can, when, for example, you use Replay Web Page, our software for replaying web archives, it's going to make a request. Basically, there's like a request to the index to be like, where is this data? And then there's a request to the actual data in the work files, but we only read the small subset of the data that we actually need at the time that the user needs it, instead of needing to load this whole big file every time up front. And I think there are a lot of efficiencies like that that we can chase if we're actually inclined to.
Okay, thank you.
One more
We
question.
have another question. Oh, we have another question in the chat. So what advice would you give to information employees for ways to demonstrate the value that come from the invisible labor that goes into organizing information?
I can take this one. So I wrote quite a bit about this in different places, but if you're interested, send me an email. I can send you a couple publications. But I think there are two major issues with organizing information, is that everyone likes their own style, and people hate to learn a common style. And I think that is what is and by the way, I came up with this a few years ago, but I think this applies for mostly everything in life, right? Everyone won their list. So I think the first challenge is to come up with this idea that we need to learn how to organize, but we need the systems and the training to organize. And I understand the invisible labor, and I think a lot of companies and institutions, they almost, in some ways, exploit that because they say, look, sorry, you don't know how to organize things, and you feel like some sort of a idiot because you're not very good at that. And then you spend your own time doing it because you feel that you should know, right? For your experience and time. That's the problem with digital infrastructure. And I think this goes back to the question of transgenerational, understanding. I don't know, my bachelor's and master's thesis were of a typewriter, right? So that doesn't mean you cannot acquire, and I'm a computational biologist. So you can think computational without computers, by the way, and you can think organization without computers, and I think that's another thing we need to divorce, is that you can spend time thinking about how to organize things, but what you're trying to do is to click, do, organize, copy files, change names of files. Oh no, this year I'm gonna change my life. I'm gonna go on a diet and I'm gonna organize my files. So I think it's...
Make a copy before doing all the changes.
Oh, absolutely. And take a picture of the scale before I do the diet, and it goes. So I think the point is that it is invisible because it's fixed costs, right? So a lot of people are paid in fixed costs. It's a fixed salary, right? We know academics, I don't want to say my hours, but we know a lot of us work 65, 70 hours a week, but we're paid 35 according to provincial standards. So I think organizing data, again, it needs to come from institutions. We need to find ways, and there are common standards, but I'll tell you, in my field, every time we sit down to create common standards for organizing biological data, you can put thousands of people in the same room. They will never agree with anything. And I think the challenges are those. So I hate to say that sometimes I think it needs to be top down. I hate the top down idea, but the cigarette, the seat belts, these things I think need sometimes to be top down. Let's see if it works top down. So create organizational, and by the way, librarians I think are, to me, a library is about the science of classification. Right? So I think, and classification is organizing. So I think that the future of libraries is to create these centers of not only information, but classification of information. And I think that's where the places where society should go, in public libraries, and librarians be trained to how people to organize. We have 3D printers now in some Montreal, right? Why not have a librarian there? You sit down and it's like, how can I organize my files better? Can you give me 10 minutes and explain? I think we need to move to this more individual behavior so that to understand there are global solutions that are scalable for organizing.
On va faire du pouce là-dessus. C'est quand tu parles d'avoir une librairie, on parlait de formation tout de suite au début. Ouais. J'avoue que celle-là, ça peut être intéressant d'arriver et de dire, Gann, écoute, tu arrives avec un employé qui est nouvellement arrivé dans une entreprise, puis voici comment on fonctionne au niveau de la classification. C'est sûr et certain que la personne va arriver et va dire, ben là, c'est comme laisse-moi travailler. Mais à un moment donné, juste lui donner des pointeurs, des hints, ça va juste l'aider à mieux gérer son information, puis peut-être aussi l'effacer. Puis, si vous me permettez, moi, je prendrais la question de Robin François. Okay? Should artificial limit should be put on digital storage like on physical storage? With paper, people have to do some work because there were no space left. Well, as an IT guy, having a page at 3 o'clock in the morning because the people just said, well, I bust my limit, can you bring me, can you put more space to my limit? At 3 o'clock in the morning because, you know, the guy has a paper to deliver or something, some presentation to do to his boss, you have this page at 3 o'clock in the morning. Pretty much, I would say to this guy, clean up before I do that. But I can't because my boss won't like it. But the thing is, it's bringing limit. The first reaction of people will do is, I won't clean up my stuff. I'm gonna call the IT guy and say, well, give me more space. Space is almost free. Well, you know, it's not free because what you put on your drive, it's replicated elsewhere. We see it by number of presentation and also back up. It's backed up. So taking 15, 20, an hour, maybe minutes per week just to do some cleanups, well, it will help you, but human behavior, mostly laziness for doing cleanup. And I'm the worst example into digital sobriety. I can actually pull out a CD and I have my first email of 1994. So I'm sure I have my backup, but it's frustrating just to take time and clean up, but it's even putting limits. People will go buy another hard drive, put it elsewhere, and have the risk of losing the data. So you have to bring it the other way. You have to tell the people that, yes, you have to do some cleanup. Just take 1 hour per week and do a cleanup. That's my point of view for putting limits on storage. Anybody else want to?
On the subject of put limits on electronic software?
I see there's a question highlighted there that I was hoping we'd get to, so maybe Robin Francois asked, are there conflicts between security policies that push for 3 copies and digital sobriety? Absolutely. Like that tension is the whole point, right? We need to make sure that we are only applying those high value treatments to things that actually deserve it and not everything. I think there was an age where that is hopefully starting to pass where people were so freaked out about an impending digital dark age that we became hoarders. We're like, we have to, so much stuff is gone, we need to get everything that we can and get it ingested or into our system and we'll figure out all the details later. And I think we need to move beyond that. So thinking about like what deserves this treatment, you know, at Webrecorder we've worked with journalists documenting war crimes, centers documenting genocide. In those cases, if there are like tweets that document war crimes against people, then absolutely, like let's do everything that we can to make sure that that is valid legal evidence, that it can be used to prosecute in the future, and that that evidence is going to stick around for the long term. Maybe not so much the mezzanine copy of like a video file from like a stage event, you know? I think it's just being mindful of what's worth it, because there are also reasons why we do, like if you take it from a threat modeling perspective, there are reasons why we do those 3 copies, right? Like this practice came from losing a lot of stuff we shouldn't have lost as a society. whether that's due to like bit rot or like, to be honest, people don't talk about these in like conference presentations, but after the presentation, when you're like having a drink and talking about it, whatever, the stories that I've heard about data loss, almost every time it's like someone forgot to update the credit card and the email saying, hey, we're gonna delete all your stuff if you don't keep paying for your account, got sent to a spam folder, something like that. Like there are these catastrophic natural disasters and random bit flips and things like that, but it's often like a more mundane reason why stuff goes missing or stuff goes wrong. Oops, someone was on mat leave and the cover didn't know about this thing, so it just lapsed. Like, yeah, it can happen. So I think the point is not that we need to stop applying these practices across the board, it's that we need to have better judgment about when to apply them.
You know, we're both IT persons, so and I've been doing backups for mostly 25 years now. Yes, 3 copies are really important. You know, I would say 3 copies. You have your backups, you have your other data into the other sites, and the other one is offline, mostly if it's not even connected to the network. That would be great. But the thing is, it's, as Tessa said, not everything needs to have 3 copies. You know, your cat video that you put on your personal folder, you really don't need 3 copies. But if you have your research or even important information that it's critical to your business, or even your tax report, better pay 3 copies of tax report, because if the government starts looking at your taxes and you don't have your copies because you delete them, well, you know, it's going to be a pretty much.
Quebec, we filed twice.
Yeah, we filed twice, so it's maybe 6 copies. But the thing is, it's not everything need to be full-blown protected. So it's, yes, 3 copies are really important, but not everything has to be 3 copies.
Do we have any other questions?
I think we have we will take a last question. It's already 12:30. So we'll take a last question that is in the chat. Where is the question?
I believe we just answered the last one. Was there one before that?
Is there anybody left there? Or they're all gone?
Yeah, there were 2 questions from Robin Francois. I believe we answered them both.
So we are done with the question? Alors, d'autres questions parmi l'assistance? Une dernière question? Non? C'est parfait. So I want to thank you, everyone. It was very interesting. I'm sure that it answered a lot of questions. So we are at the end of the conference. So I think it was useful for almost everybody. Thank you for all your thanks notes in the chat. So I wish you all a great day, and thank you to attending this event. It was very great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you again, everyone, for coming into ForSpace today for this conversation. Those of you online, those of you in the space, thanks for everyone for participating. Just to let you know, we're going to close up the Zoom and the live stream now, but a reminder, this conversation is available forever online if you'd like to revisit or share it there.